kasha aktor. We brought two brises, and there seems to be a stira regarding the case of Malika and the case of aktor sachelin. So ulatamech techshuchlach igufa. The whole brisa is contradictory. Diktani lo amru ela Pesach bilvad. When is it going to be possible on Pesach? Mareitani echad hashoiche, the echad hazoyre, the echad hamoylek, the echad hamazeh, and moylek and mazeh are clearly not the korban Pesach. It's clearly a bird chatas. Elavahar Rab Shimon. Both prices are Rab Shimon. And Malika loikasha kan bar bosar kan l'chol shemoy. One brisa is on the 14th, where you're not over when you sacrifice the bird animal. The other is chol shemoy, where where the problem with chametz exists no matter what kind of korban you're offering, which is consistent with his shita. Haktor nami loikasha tanoi. Because that's based on the machlokes Tanoim and how Rab Shimon learns. The iked the mekish aktor l'shchita, veikem adoloi mekish. Some say that just like it's also to be shoichet al chametz, it's also to be maktor al chametz, and the other does not connect haktor to shchita. Period. Rabbi Yehuda Omer afatami. Rabbi Yehuda said that even if you own chametz and you shech the korban tamid, you're over the line. My time at Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Lacha Zivchi. My zevach am yuchad li. The zevach that's for me. My new the tamid, because every day the other tamid is offered for Kodesh Baruch Hu. Rab Shimon Omer Pesach bar Bosa. Rab Shimon said you're only chayiv for the love of shechting on chametz when you shech the korban Pesach on the 14th, but on Yom Tif of Pesach, on the third day, fourth day of Pesach, you're chai for any korban. My time, Reb Shimon. Tichsiv zivchi trei zimni. Kori bei zevach zvochai, which is my multiple korbanos, all my korbanos. Now, l'mayil chasel pagin rachmanim adodi. Now, why did the Torah mention both the low cost of zivchai, but have to mention it both singularly? The Meimar, to teach me bismandi ikazevach lo machayv as v'chai. When there is korbanos, you're not machayv for the other korbanos, like on Erev Pesach, which is the Zman Korban Pesach. Then you're not chayiv for the love of having chametz with you on shechting the other korbanos. But during Chol HaMoed, when you not have the korban Pesach, then you would be chayiv. Then the Brisa said, "Uvemoyed lishmoi potter." When you shech the korban Pesach, let's say on the third day of Pesach, you would not be chayiv for the love of shechting on chametz. Time of the shaloi lishmo. That's because he enunciated, "I'm shechting it shaloi lishmo." But let's say he was silent. Hastama l'chora, you'd be potter. Amai. Why would that? Pesach b'shayim asashon is shlom madi. It should be a good korban, because when you shech the korban Pesach, shaloi lishmo, the rest of the year, it's a kosher shlomi. So are you telling me that since he was silent, it won't work, and Shema enough from there you learn Pesach b'shayim asashon boy akira? I mean, it's not enough to just have a silent kavanah, but that you actually have to uproot it b'maisa. No. The Chabura throughout the halacha kagon shayu bailim tmei meis. This was a case where the bailim were tamei. They were nidchel pesach sheni. This stamel l'shum pesach koi. In a regular situation in a chanami, maybe you'd have to be oiker. But in this situation, it was clearly designed to be waited until pesach sheni. So even when you were silent, it means you had the stam kavana. It would be the korban pesach, and that's why in that case you'd be chayiv for the lav of shechting al chametz.
Korban Pesach, you also chayiv al sichor adam al chametz adam sichor.
That was the machlokes between. That was the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says you're chayiv during Pesach for all the other korbanos if you own chametz, correct? But not
No,
on
but
the
for
but the korban Pesach only on Yud Dalet.
No, but Pesach Sheni. What do you do about Pesach Sheni if you check the Pesach?
No, but here we're talking about he shechted the Pesach. He had a korban Pesach
Right,
that was
right.
designated korban Pesach. It was the fourth day of
Right.
Pesach.
It doesn't
And he
apply to
shechted-
Pesach. Yeah.
He sechted quietly.
Right.
So you can't bring a raya from there that in all cases you don't need. In this case, he was Tamei Meis, so it was clear that he was saving this Korban Pesach as a Korban Pesach because he was going to use it Pesach Sheni. So that's why now if he shechts it on Al Chametz, but on Pesach Sheni, there's no lav of Chametz. The lav of Chametz during the 8 days of Pesach.
But if he shechted the Pesach on the fourth day, you're still chayav for having chometz, but not on the special.
In that case, when he doesn't make a verbal akira, it was stam kavona. In that case, since that korban is clearly oimed lepesach, he'd be chayiv for the lav of shechting on chametz. Correct. Yeah. Mishnah. The Mishnah is now going to go through how the korban pesach was actually shechted in the Beis Hamikdash. HaPesach nishchat b'sholosh kitos. No matter whether the tzibur was very large, whether the tzibur was very small, they didn't all shecht at one time. The mitzvah was to divide it into 3 groups, one after another. And they went in as three distinct groups. Certainly, if you couldn't fit, there's no choice. But even when the group was small, where technically you could do it all at one time, they didn't do it all at one time. They did it in 3 groups. Shnei Amar, and that's learned from a pasuk. V'shachatu oso kol kahal adas Yisrael. So you have 3 groups: kahal, Ada, and Yisrael. That teaches me that you have to do it in 3 groups. Nichnasa kasa rishona. So the first group goes into the Azara. Remember, there's 11 amos where Klal Yisrael, even if you're non-Kohen, could stand. And then there are 11 amos of the Azara, which they cannot stand, and only the Kohanim can be there. But the Israelim could go into the area where they could go. The Smala Azara, this part filled up. No alu daltoisa Azara. They closed the doors that opened up into the Azara. Taku, Heiriu, the Taku. They blew a tkiya, trua, tkiya. HaKohanim oimdim, shuros. The Kohanim stood in a long line of single file from the Azara to the Mizbeach. And maybe there were 100 shuros or 50 shuros. Think about the old fire brigades when they used to line up and they would pass a bucket of water from one person to another person to another person from where the water was until the house that was burning. That's how we have to view this. HaKohanim oimdim shuros. They were holding bowls of silver or bowls of gold. Not mixed up. One line was silver, one line was gold. Shura shekula kesef. Shura kula zav. Lo yomura, they weren't mixed up. Okay. The loyal of Ezekiel shulayim. These bowls did not have legs to put, so you'd be able to easily put them down on the ground. They were like rounded on the bottom. Shema yanichu mikarish adam. They wanted to discourage the Kohanim by not having legs on these kind of bowls. Think about a mixing bowl where you mixed flour, one of those metal mixing bowls that are completely, round. They didn't want the Kohanim to put them on the floor because the blood would get what they're going to do is they're going to be transferring the blood that they do Kabbalah on from the Shechita over to the Mizbeach to do Zrika. So if they had put legs on the bottoms of these bowls, maybe a Kohen would put it down on the ground, the blood would get coagulated, that's a problem. So now everyone is standing where they are. Shachat Yisrael, a Yisrael could do the Shechita because Shechita is kosher bizarre. You don't need the Kohen to do the Shechita. The Kibel HaKohen. However, from Kabbalah on, it's ma'akev if it's not a kohen. So the kohen had to do the initial Kabbalah. And then once he was makabel, the blood in the kli, noisna l'chavero v'chaver l'chavero. Now, each one of them is already holding an empty bowl. So each kohen makabel samole umachzer sarekon. When he received the full bowl, he handed the guy who gave it to him an empty one. And that's how they kept on replenishing empty keli. Kohen hakor v'etzel hamizbeach, the kohen that was closest to the mizbeach, zorko zrika achas keneged hayisod. He would dump with one zrika the whole blood next to the yisod of the mizbeach. Okay. Now, everybody in that first group had finished shechting and doing the zrika sadam. So therefore, yotzes kas rishoina, v'nichnas kas shniya. So the first group of Yisraelim file out, and the second group comes in. And then they did the process the same way. Yotzes shniya, nichnas shlishis. The second group went out, and the third group went in. Kemaisa rishoina, kach maisa shniya v'ashlishis. The same way the first group did it, so too the second and third. Now, while this was going on, Koru es a Hallel. They recited Hallel. Now, let's say they finished Hallel, and they were still in the process of shechting and doing zrika. So, im gam shonu, so they would repeat the Hallel. And the im shonu, they repeated it, it was still going on, shilshu. They repeated it a third time. Afal pi shlo shilshu mimeim. Although the Mishnah gives us testimony that it never happened that they had to read Hallel for 3 times. Not only that, Rabbi Yehuda oimer mimeim shel kas shlishis lo higiu la'ahavta ki yishma Hashem b'nei she'ama mu'atim. In the time of Bayis Sheni, it was never a case where the third group that went in, that the Hallel had even reached Ahavta ki yishma Hashem, which is like half of Hallel, which means they never had so many people that the third group would actually finish Hallel, that they had never really made it to half Hallel. Now, Kimaseu Bachol, this description of how they did it, if it was a weekday, Kach Maseu b'Shabbos. It didn't change any of this procedure if Erev Pesach fell on Shabbos. Rav Ela Shakohanim Medich B'Sazor Shelo B'Tzon Chachamim. The only difference was the Kohanim sort of rinsed out the Azara from its blood because they didn't want to change the normal minig that they did. There was like a stream. When they wanted to rinse out the Azor, they would close off where the stream left. So like a dam, it would fill up behind. The water would flood the floor of the Azor. Through this means they rinsed the Azara. It was a floor of marble. Then they would open up again the opening where the stream would flow out. So Erev Pesach, there was so much blood because of all the shechita. So was normally, they did this type of rinsing. The Kohanim would do it on Shabbos as well, but the Chachamim were not happy about that. The Gemara will explain why not. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi says they did something else. They would take a cup and they would gather up the blood that was on the floor. And that's a taruvis, a mixture of all of this blood from different korbanos. So ceremoniously, Zorko Zrika Achas Lagabi Mizbeach, so he did another Zrika. And the Chachamim were not happy about this either. We'll see why not. Now, in the Beis HaMikdash, they've now shechted, and they've done the Zrika. So now they have to process the animal. They have to butcher it. So Ketzad Toilin Umafshitin. So how did they hang the animal so you could strip the hide off the animal? There were hooks of steel, iron, that were fixed on the walls and on posts. They would hang the carcass and they would strip it. And there were so many people there. Let's say there weren't enough hooks. So so they had sticks that were thin and sharp, smooth. So one person would put the stick on his shoulder, and his friend would have the stick on his shoulder. And between the two of them, they would hang the carcass and they would strip it. Rather than use these sticks, because the Rambam says these were muktzah, so they would use an arm. They would put their arm on the friend in front of them, and they would hang the tolo mafshit. They would do the same procedure. Crow.
How could the arm support such an animal like that?
It wasn't that big. It's a small sheep, might be 60, 80 pounds.
It was a little shepsela, maybe it's 60 pounds.
That's what I said, 60 or 80 pounds.
Uh-huh.
It might not have been we're not talking about a cow, we're talking about a sheep. Technically, a goat is allowed as well. It's also called a kebes. So obviously they were able to do it. Kra'o, they tore it open. The Hotzis Seymour, they took out the innards, the intestines, the chalev. Nosno b'megis, they would put this on a tray. Viktir al gabe mizbeach, and the chalev and the emurim were put on the mizbeach. Now,
I presume that the Kohen did that, no?
Of course, the Kohanim did that because Israelim cannot walk on the Azara where the mizbeach is.
And so they must have given them that intro thing.
They gave them the trail. They gave them the tray. The Megis and the Kohanim would offer it on the mizbeach. Now there was a procedure how they all left. We're talking about on Shabbos. They couldn't carry the Korban Pesach home with them. There was no Eruv, perhaps. Rashi says, they couldn't carry the Pesach back to their homes yet. So they had to sit and wait it until Motzei Shabbos. We're talking about on cases where Erev Pesach was Shabbos. So Yatza Kasser Rishon, V'yashim lo b'har habayis. They would sit on the har habayis. Shniya b'chil. Chil is there was like an area with pillars around, and they would sit there. Vashlishis b'mkoy moemedes. The Shlishis stayed where they were, in the Ezra Snoshim, or in the Azor where they were. And then Chashecha, Yotzu v'tzolos Pischayim. Then they were up. Remember, if Erev Pesach was Monday through Friday, Sunday through Friday, once they were finished, they could carry their Pesach home, and they could start roasting it. You couldn't eat it until nightfall, but you could slow roast it. On Motzei Shabbos, of course, they'd have to start roasting it only after Shabbos. I guess then by the time, then they would start the Seder. Remember, even in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, the main meal was the Korban Chagiga that they ate. And the Korban Pesach was only eaten as dessert after the main meal. So they would have a nice piece of steak or brisket from the Chagiga, and they would do Vehigata to Levincha like we do. They had Vehigata to Levincha and then eat their meal. And then 3-4 hours of roasting, that was, then they could eat the Korban. Remember, they had to eat the Korban Pesach prior to Chatzos Halayla. So they would do it before Chatzos Halayla, and they would eat that as a dessert, as the dessert for the original meal. Amar Rav Yitzchak, Ein HaPesach nishchat, ela b'sholosh kitois, shel shloishim b'nei adam. That means usually they would bring in 90 people at least, because a kahal is asara, the Eda asara, the Israel asara, so it comes out 30. You have to have at least 30 in each group. My taima, kahal, the Eda of Israel. So remember, we learned the whole din of minyan from Eda, because ibadlu mitocha Eda hazos va'achaleh osam karaga. By the Meraglim, it says that they were called an Eda. Yoshua and Kalev, we know originally there were 12 Meraglim, but Kalev and Yoshua were not part of those hibadlu mitocha Eda hazos. So since 10 Meraglim were called Eda, from there is the source that you need at least 10. And Kahal and Yisrael also has to be 10. Now, Mesaf Kalon, we were in doubt, did they have to go in, all 30, Sholosh Kitos Shel Asara Asara, Hilkach Sholosh Kitos Be'inon, Dilva V'Zachar Zekoma, V'Shel Shlosh Be'in, maybe only 30 between the three of them. Or maybe you need bevas achas, and you have to bring 30 one time. Hilkach, be'inan sholosh kita, shloshim shlosh be'adam. So since we're a suffix, we always brought 30 in at a time. Bevas achas ha'ika, because either way, if it's bevas achas, you have bevas achas. If it's achas ha'ika, you were able to fulfill both sveikas. And therefore, hilkach b'chamshin nami sagya. If you only had 50 people altogether, it would work, because the Eili plus in the 30 would go in and do it. Eili Asara, 10 new would go in, Vinafki Asara, 10 would go out. Eili Asara, Vinafki, and then the last 10 would go in, 10 would go out. So you'd have at least 30 connected to each group. Nichnas Akasri Shoya, Itmar, Baya Omar, Nina Lutznan. That means the doors closed by themselves. Rav Amar Noyalin. Rav said, no, it wasn't B'neis. The people closed it. My binayu, what's nafkamina? Ik binayu, lemis mechanisa. Whether they relied on the nes or not. Abai Amar Ninalu, Tnan. Kama da Ailum Ailu. Because they didn't count carefully how many were going in. The Samchina Anisa, how do you know the doors will be able to close? Because maybe there's so many people. Samchina Anisa, we relied on a nes. Rava Amar Noyal Insnan. The law Samchina Anisa, we did not rely on the nes, and we calculated. Oh, so many will fit, so we'll be able to close the door. There was in Masechta Ediyas, there's a debate whether one of the Tanoim, Akavi ben Mahalalel, was put into Cherem or not. Because there's a debate there where he had a dialogue with Shmai Vav Talyon, And it says that they put him into cherem. Because it says there, the doors of the Azor never closed on a person, Klal Yisrael, who had so much chokhmah and yiras chet like a kavod b'mahalal. So it never could be that they had that they put him into cherem. So nineles is the word that seems to suggest it closes on its own. So Abai Matarza Tamei, V'Rabbi Matarza Tamei. Abai Matarza Tamei, Ein Ba'azara B'Shar Sheninala Al Kol Adam Yisrael. There was never a time when the Jewish people were in Azara and the door closed on its own. There was never a person B'Chochma Yiras Chet Kakavim Allah. Rava Matarza Tamei. Rava was Matarza like him. Ein Ba'azara B'Shar Shenoya Linoisa. There was never a time when they closed the doors that the Jewish people were in Azara, that there was a greater person. Okay. Ton Rabbanon, may olam lo nismaich adam bazara. Nobody was ever squashed in the Azara. Chutz mi Pesach echad shahaya b'mei Hillel, shenismaich bo zakin echad. One of the elders there got squashed. So Pesach Meuchin. That year they called it a squash Pesach. Kon Rabbanon, Pamachas Bikesh Agrippas HaMelech, Litin Einav B'chlusa Yisrael. Agrippas, he was a king. He was after Herod. Herod's rule was up until about 10 CE. Remember, the Churban was 70 CE. So Agrippas was one of the Roman kings who had been appointed as a Roman king there. And he wanted to do a census of Klal Yisrael. Amar le Kohen Gadol, he told the Kohen Gadol, Teine necha b'Psachim, listen, a way to make a census is let's count how many Korban Pesachs there are. So what did the Kohen Gadol do? Natul kuli mikolecha. He took a kidney from each Korban Pesach. V'nimtzu sham shishim ribo zuge kloyos. They found 600,000 pairs of kidney, which is 1.2 million kidneys. So there were 1.2. He took one kidney from every Korban Pesach. So there was 1.2 million Korban Pesachs brought. Kiflayim ki yotzei Mitzrayim, double than the amount of people that left Mitzrayim. Of course, you have to include people who were tamei or traveling that would have given their Pesach on Pesach Sheni. So the number was a lower number. Technically,
But
the number.
how do you get, if it's 1.2 million, they were chaburas. In the chabura, they were at least.
Good.
How's that possible?
Right now, Agrippa was not that aware of halacha.
Sharp.
So right now, that's where we are. Like Walter says, there was no Pesach that there weren't at least 10 people subscribed to the Korban Pesach. So right now you got 12 million people, right? If you have 1.2 million Korban Pesach and a minimum of 10 people per each, so a minimum of 12 million. By Korno so Pesach Me'ubim. That year they called it a Pesach because there were so many people. Now the Gemara asks, Nital Kulya, what do you mean take the kidney? Haboyak Torah. Remember, the kidneys are part of the emurim, part of the inner organs that were removed and offered on the Mizbeach. How could the Kohen Gadol take a kidney? So the Gemara says, the Hadir Maktilu. Yeah, they did maktir it, but they put it off to a side before they were maktir it so they could count. Freik the Gemara of a Haksiv, V'hiktiro shelo ya'arev chalavav shel zeh b'zeh. Each korban pesach, it says, has to be offered by itself, so that there shouldn't be one chaylev mixing with the other chaylev. So the hadar matalu chada chada. And a chanami, says the Gemara, he offered after they gathered the kidneys, they offered each a morim by itself the way you're supposed to. For the Gemara Vatanya the hikti ram, it says that they were just offered together. It says vikti ram akwanim mizbecha lechem mishal re'el kolal. And that means all the amorim have to go together. How could he offer the kidney separately? Ela tfisa ba'alma in a chanami. They didn't separate it. They just took a look. They looked. The shoklu minayu ad yavlen midi achrina. They would see, and then they would put a siman somewhere else to keep the count. And then later on, they counted those simanim. Means each time they saw a kidney, they put a stone in a box, and then later on they counted the stones. That's how the Gemara learns. Rashi says, "Toifes kul yomar le'shliach v'hu in pulo even kenegda." He would put a bean or a stone in a basket as they were, bringing them up to the mizbeach. Then the Mishnah said, Kohanim oimdi shuros. The Kohanim were standing in these fire brigade lines. My time, means, why would the rows have to be either silver or gold, separate? Why couldn't they be mixed? Because maybe, they were worried about theft, right? One would give a silver, one would keep a golden bowl and give the guy back a silver one. So I understand. But even among the silver bowls or the golden bowls, there were some bowls that are bigger, some of the bowls are smaller, some that are worth $200, some that are worth $100. So if you're worried about theft, there'd be theft with that as well. It's more orderly. It looks nicer that each one was the same color. It's like an aesthetic thing. It's to keep it looking nice. We said that these bowls didn't have legs, so they shouldn't put it down on the ground. There were no bowls that had legs, except the bowl that you put the spice for the lechem aponim. The legs, if you put it on the lechem aponim, it could break the lechem aponim. So those bezichim had legs. Then the Mishnah said, "Shochat Yisrael v'kibel hakohen," that a non-kohen shechted, and the kohanim were makabel. Freit Gemara lo sagi the lav Yisrael. What, couldn't the kohen do it if he wanted to? So he gufa kamash malad the shchita bizarre ksheva that erchanami. It's not that the kohen can't do it, but the Mishnah wanted to give us halacha that a shchita is kosher bizarre with a non-kohen. The kibel kohen and hakamash malad mikabala ve'elech mitzvahs kuna, and erchanami from Kabbalah and on, that has to be done by a kohen. Otherwise, ma'akev the korban. And then each person knows l'chaveru. Shma mino halacha shlo b'regel avi halacha. Now, the word halacha means walking. Now here, it seems like nobody walked. They just stood there and they passed one bowl, down the line. So can we really call that halacha? And that halacha shaloi b'regel, is that called halacha? So the Gemara says maybe dilma hunayit purta. So no, could be that maybe they shuffled their feet a little bit. So elamai kamash malan. So then what are you teaching me by the fact that they handed it to each other? Kamash malan beravam hadras melech. That to do it in this fashion, where the Azara was full of Kohanim in this fire brigade line, it's Baravam Adras Melech. There's a lot of people involved, making it more chashuv. That everybody is working in the avoda. Then the Mishnah said, Kibela Samole, Umazur Sarekon, that the guy received the full bowl first, and then gave the guy the empty one. Aval ibchalo, but to give the empty one and then take the full one, no. Misaila Rav Shimon Lakish, Rav Shimon Lakish, ein marvin ala mitzvahs. You don't pat. Here's a mitzvah in front of you. The mitzvah in front of you is to do the halacha. So you got to do that before you do anything, not to push it off. Because you're ein marvin ala mitzvahs. Then the Mishnah said, Koina koravetz la mizbeach. The kohen that was near the mizbeach would throw the blood. Man Tana Pesach the Zrika. Now, who is the Tana who says that you need to do Zrika on the mizbeach, and it's not enough to just pour it on the Yisod? Rav Chizra Rav Yosef Glili, the Tana Rav Yosef Glili Omer, as damam tizrok ala mizbeach, the es chelbam taktir. Domo lo nemar, ela domo. It says blood plural. Chelbo lo nemar, ela chelbam. Limed al bechor meiser upesach. This is a category of three. Korban bechor, which is the firstborn of any animal. The korban meiser, which is the 10th animal that you count. Upesach, shehein tu'unin matin domim, the emur legabe mizbeach. They do require zrik of the dam on the mizbeach and the emur in legabe mizbeach. Minolan the tu'unin yisod. But how do you know that you need to put it on the mizbeach that has a yisod? Because not all the mizbeach has a yisod. By describing that they have to do zrika on the part of the mizbeach that has a yisod, so how do you know that? Amr Abelazar, asya zrika me ola. We learn the din of zrika from ola to korban pesach. Ksivacha as damam tizrak ala mizbeach by the korban pesach. Uksivasa bizarre kubner na kohanim is damam mizbeach saviv. Ma ola to uni yisod. The korban ola. Where do you do the zrika? On the part of the mizbeach that has the yisod. Av pesach nami to on yisod. Okay. So Mirz Hashem, it's a small block tomorrow. We'll learn it at 7:30 evening tomorrow night prior to the
Navi.
we shared 8 o'clock. Okay, so 7:30 p.m. tomorrow night.
Okay.
There's no
Yeah.